So last time we talked about benefits and disadvantages of clear cutting. So one of the disadvantages of clear cutting is that we have a lot of soil erosion, right? We're losing a lot of soil because the trees are not holding the soil in very much anymore. We have a lot of habitat fragmentation and habitat destruction. We're not getting as much CO2 taken out of the air, and the air that's being provided by the trees is less, so we're not having air filtration. We're also not getting water filtration. We're heating up our stream beds, which is not great because cold water holds oxygen better. Thank you. So cold water holds oxygen better, which means there's more oxygen available for plants and animals in the water. So those are all disadvantages. Some advantages of clear cutting, though, is that you can replant the area. Like you can do a mass replanting. The trees get a lot of sunlight because they're not competing with bigger trees already there. You have less roads being built because you're just driving to one location, and less CO2 being produced in the process of clear cutting. So selective cutting, on the opposite hand, is where you're driving to lots of different areas and you're only cutting down a small amount of trees. And like the big idea of this is that there's less impact and that trees can reseed themselves naturally. So we don't have to go back and plant new trees. These trees can drop seeds and new seedlings can grow in these little pockets that we have taken trees out of. So that's like the big idea of that. So, oops. Advantages and disadvantages are on the same slide this time, so we can just kind of talk through them. So, advantages of selective cutting. It removes a single tree or a relatively small amount of trees, and it provides small openings where this is literally what we just wrote down on the last slide, so don't write it again. The disadvantages of selective cutting is you need to construct logging roads to carry equipment and workers into the area. So we're going to have a lot of habitat fragmentation that way. We're going to have a lot of roads going into and out of different areas, which means that you have a lot of roads and building roads and compacting soil and fragmenting habitats that way. You're also going to have more CO2 production that way because you're going to those places. And the trees that you replant may or may not survive depending on the competition with the other bigger trees. So let's talk about sustainable forestry. We talked about things that are happening, talked about different ways that people are clearing the forest. So how do we use the forest sustainably? How can we make sure that we are taking this resource and actually being respectful with it? So number one is reforestation. Now whenever a forest is cut down, there should be reforestation happening. And we don't see this happening a lot because what is the number one use of the forest, especially in Brazil? Agriculture, yeah, agriculture. So because people are using these areas for cattle and for farming, they're not always reforesting areas that they have cut down. And then also finding companies or products that are sustainable. So they use ecologically sustainable forestry techniques, or they use reclaimed wood. So like instead of destroying a structure that's made out of wood, they'll take the wood apart and they'll use that wood again. So they have more sustainable techniques than just cutting down more trees. Another way to have a sustainable forest is wildfire mitigation. So now we're kind of shifting from using the forest agriculturally just to sustainable forestry in general. So wildfire mitigation. The problem with wildfires is humans tend to put them out. Which you might be saying, D-Hart, that sounds silly, like we need to put out fires. It's literally destroying environments. But the truth of the matter is that areas that catch on fire are areas that have caught on fire before humans actually lived there, and so they can bounce back really easily. And the more fires you have, the more small fires that are quick fires, the more debris that is actually cleaned up off the forest floor. But if humans come in and stop those fires from happening, more and more debris is going to pile up on the forest floor, and so it's going to cause a bigger, stronger, more deadly fire to come through. And so some plants can actually survive going through a fire if the fire isn't too terribly hot, which you might be saying, fires are hot, like what are you talking about? But some fires burn hotter than other fires. And so if it's a really hot fire, it'll completely kill the plant, where if it's just a normal fire, the plant will survive and no real harm is going to happen. And so prescribed burns are burns that are set by humans in areas to kind of start that process again. The big reason why humans usually stop fires from burning is because humans' houses or human property is being threatened, which is like with the Traverse Mountain fire. If we didn't have a million people living on Traverse, they probably would have let the fire just go through. But since there were so many houses and the fire was so close to houses, they were really concerned about it. And then protection from pathogens and insects. So we'll talk about this in just a little bit. When I say a little bit, I mean in the next class period. But so an IPM is an integrated pest management system. So it's a way to kind of look at how we are dealing with pests and diseases in a forest and making sure that it is taken care of sustainably. So, any questions about how we use forest for agriculture, clear cutting, selective cutting, and sustainable forestry? All right, cool. Turn to your table. Let's just take a little debrief. Tell them the number one thing you got from that little section. So, what's the one thing that really stands out to you from using forest for agriculture, clear cutting, selective cutting, sustainable agriculture, or sustainable forestry? Okay, turn and talk. From not making enough food for the world's population to being able to make enough food for the world's population. There you go. So, the Green Revolution happened in the 1950s and the 1960s. And if I was a history teacher, I would tell you what the significance of the 1950s and 60s were, but all I know is that, that's the Gatsby time, right? Cars were being invented, flappers. That's all I know. I'm not a history teacher. But in agriculture, we were having the Green Revolution. So the big things about the Green Revolution, or the big things that took us from not being able to make enough food for the world's population to be able to sustain the world's population, is number one, mechanization. We now were able to use tractors and plows and seeding machines to do the work of 10 different people by one person in half the time. So we could plant more crops, we could use more land, we could take care of more food with less people. So it became cheaper for farmers to be able to do their job. The next one is genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. So, regardless how you feel about GMOs, if you've ever eaten a Pop-Tart which you guys are of the teenage persuasion, which I can almost guarantee everyone in here has tasted a Pop-Tart before, and if you haven't, you should. They're delicious. But if you look on the wrapper of a Pop-Tart, it says made with GMOs. GMOs are not, there's a lot of taboo around them. If you want to talk to me about it, I have a lot of feelings about GMOs. Talk about it in my botany class when I used to teach it. But GMOs, these are crops that are either resistant to frost, which is a big deal. Like if you have a little backyard garden like I did, as soon as frost hits, your plants are gone. Like there's nothing you can do. If you have an early frost and then it warms back up, too bad, so sad. They have plants that are resistant to drought. They can create plants that are resistant to different pests. And so this makes our crops stronger, and we're losing less crops every single year. Fertilization, this is where we actually have learned how to take nitrogen and phosphorus and put them in a granular form so we can throw them on the crops, and since it is a limiting factor, our crops are going to grow better. Irrigation, we no longer have to worry about, is it going to rain? Are my crops going to survive? Do I need to do a rain dance to make sure that my food is being produced? We are taking water from different areas and we are putting it on our fields. And last but not least, pesticides. So we're using pesticides to get rid of pests that are competing for our crops. So these 5 things are the big drivers of the Green Revolution. So if you look over here, you can see that in the 1800s, nobody was making that much food. We were all staying pretty stable. But as soon as the 1950s hit, the amount of food we were able to make has skyrocketed. So the US is red, so you can see that we are right here. China, they've done really, really well. If you look at the UK and France, like they've been able to make so much more food because of the Green Revolution that happened starting in the 1950s. So let's talk about the number one thing we talked about, mechanization. So what are the pros and cons of mechanization when it comes to the Green Revolution and agriculture? So number one, like I said, increased area of production. You can use so much more of your land that you couldn't have used before. You can buy more acres and actually sustainably use them for crops. Number two is increased efficiency and productivity. So like I said, you can do the work of 10 people by 1 person in half the time. So you're definitely more efficient and you have more product that is being created. And then last but not least, we have reduced costs and increased profit, which again, this is like something we're going to come back to when we talk about environmental science, is that no one is out there progressively trying to kill the earth. Like people don't wake up in the morning and be like, you know what sounds like a great idea, let's destroy the thing that's keeping us alive. The motivation for most people is profits, because money buys for food and shelter and clothing and medicine, and that keeps you alive. And so the goal to have a better life isn't necessarily an evil goal, but we need to figure out the pros and cons of what we're doing. So the biggest con and like the only real big con for this is that it increases our reliance on fossil fuels. So since we're using machines now to do the work that we used to do with, you know, our arms and our legs and shovels and rakes and pickaxes and so on and so forth, all of those were fossil fuel free. If you had a horse pulling a plow behind it, you're not using any fossil fuels. However, if you're using a tractor or a backhoe or an excavator, you're going to be using fossil fuels. And so this increases the pollution from fossil fuels, and it also increases our reliance on fossil fuels. The next big step in the Green Revolution was GMOs. So, pros of GMOs: plants can be modified to repel predatory insects and reducing the need for pesticides. So if we can find plants that that repel insects themselves, then we don't have to use pesticides, which is awesome, right? Because pesticides are not the greatest. They can kill other animals rather than what you're just trying to kill. So if we had a plant that either bugs didn't like the taste of, or there was a smell it produced that drove plants away, like if you're ever planting a backyard garden, sometimes they'll plant like mint or different herbs around other plants because sometimes the aroma or like the natural oils that are produced by those herbs will repel insects. And so they'll take those characteristics and put them in the genes of other plants to naturally repel insects, which is pretty cool. Hello. Thank you. Number 2, plants be modified to be resistant to herbicides. So again, herbicides are sprays we spray on our plants to kill the weeds around it. Weeds are bad for gardens because they compete for the same nutrients in the same space as other plants. So if we can make plants resistant to herbicides, then we can just spray the whole entire crop field. All the things that we don't want to die will survive, while all the things that we do want to die will go away, which will make it really beneficial. And then lower cost to consumers. So the more GMOs we use, the less pesticides you're going to have to use, the less crops you're going to lose to insects. It means that you're going to be able to make crops for cheaper, which means that consumers can buy crops for a more reasonable price. And then the big con for this one, is loss of biodiversity. That if everybody is growing the same type of crop, the same exact genetic crop, we're not going to have any biodiversity in the crops we're eating. Which, you might be saying that's not a big deal, but if we have a pest or a disease come through that is specific to that crop, it's going to wipe out all of those crops. And what do we learn about biodiversity? Is more biodiversity or less biodiversity better for an environment? More, right? The more biodiverse an environment is, the healthier it is, which is awesome. Next, we have chemical fertilization. So fertilizer. The 2 pros of fertilizer is increased growth and it's inexpensive. So you can grow more plants, bigger crops, and you can do it for cheap. And for the first time, we have more cons than we have pros for fertilizer. So number 1, air pollution. The process that it takes to turn nitrogen and phosphorus into fertilizer produces a lot of air pollution, like a lot. Water pollution and algal blooms and eutrophication. We talked all about all of these when we talked about nutrient cycling, and we talked about like the bad side of the phosphorus cycle and the nitrogen cycle. So if if the fertilizer gets into the waterway, it'll cause algae to grow. As that algae grows out of control, it's going to block out the sun and not allow anything to grow underneath it. And as soon as that algae dies off, the decomposers in the water are going to use up all of the oxygen to decompose the algae, and we're going to end up with a eutrophic zone, or a zone that no animal or plant can live in. We have 2 more to go through, then we're going to stop and chat with people at your table. So, hang with me. Oh. Okay, let's talk about irrigation and pesticides, a different one. Okay, so just for those 3, let's take a break. Talk to your neighbors. If you have 3 at a table, which the majority of people have about 3 at a table. If you have more than that, then, or less than that. So, and let's have you go over with the table behind you, so there's 3. And then let's have one of you 4 just right now go to the back eye table, so there's 3 there, and everybody picks one of the 3 things to talk about for the Green Revolution and talk about the pros and the cons. So go ahead, decide what you're going to talk about, and talk to your tables about it.
Agriculture, mechanization.
Okay, so are you going to talk about mechanization, or are you going to talk about GMOs, or are you going to talk about you guys each pick your own. Okay, fertilizer, cool. GMOs are okay. The mechanization is what keeps it. Okay, so you're gonna go through, you're gonna discuss as a table, or like the person who has the topic. Just kind of go over the pros and cons and the treatment.
Fertilizer has.
Alright, so with the 3 things we fairly talked about, we talked about mechanization, GMOs, and fertilizer. So each of you guys are just gonna pick one of them. So mechanization, GMOs, fertilizer, and you're just gonna kind of go over it. Just kind of like you kind of digest. Alright, so who did what over here? Let's see. You did? Who did what? you feeling, Victor? Pretty good? Okay. How are you feeling, Mike? Pretty good? Amazing. Wow. Pros. So basically you're saying you can teach this class for your next. How are you doing, Victor? Pretty good? Check. Back, you're doing good? Alright, so continuing on with agriculture, we're going to talk about, so this is just talking about what we just really talked about. We're going to talk about soil conservation. So when we're doing agriculture, we're using our agricultural practices, we need to make sure that we're conserving our soil. And we've just really talked about, I'm using the word talked about, or that phrase, so much. Last time when we discussed the destruction of rainforests, we talked about how soil conservation is really big when it comes to agriculture because the native plants that were holding the soil in place are now starting to be gone. And so when you have these agricultural lands for either plants or for animals, we lose a lot of soil. And so these are different ways that we can conserve our soil in agriculture. So, improving soil fertility. So even before we talk about keeping soil in place, let's talk about how can we make sure that our soil does not lose its fertility, which is another big problem when we talked about the rainforest, is that the soil there is not very nutrient rich. So you can only use the soil for a certain amount of time before it no longer works. So nutrients need to be replenished and the soil fertility needs to be restored. So 3 different ways that we can do this. Number 1 is crop rotation. So different crops take different nutrients outside, out of the soil. And so if you rotate the crops, you're going to be taking different nutrients out of the soil every single year. So if you grow the same crops there, eventually you're going to deplete the soil of those nutrients and those crops won't be able to live there anymore. But if you rotate every single year, each crop is going to take out different nutrients, and so you can use the soil for longer. Green manure. Green manure is where you will plant crops that either are nitrogen rich or they can bring nitrogen into the soil. And then limestone. So limestone has a really cool ability because it reduces toxic levels of metals such as aluminum and manganese, and it releases valuable nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus and sulfur, which are things that we usually put into the crops via fertilizer. And so if we have limestone in our soil, that's going to do all of the benefits without having to make the fertilizer itself. Freak out. I'm just gonna. Perfect. Okay, this is exactly where I want to be for next time. So next time we're going to talk about irrigation and how it affects crops, which is what our lab is about. So we'll be able to finish up our lab and tie the results of our lab into irrigation. It is time to stop so we can review what we talked about today and make sure we're feeling pretty good.